Hello, my name is Jim Tierney, and I'm a lecturer on law at Harvard Law School, where I teach classes, counsel students, and I direct the State Attorney General Clinic. I had the honor of being the Attorney General of my own state, Maine, for over 10 years. And since that time, I have worked with attorneys general from all over the country, consulting with them on some of the most difficult issues that they face, and I also teach. And every 2 years, I help orient the newly elected attorneys general. So this presentation is my effort to try to communicate to you an overview of this important office. The views are mine. They're not designed to give legal advice. There are plenty of people who disagree with me. But it is, I think, my chance to try to communicate in what is an office which is emerging as a more and more important legal entity with every passing decade. So if you want to follow along, you can go to my personal website, stateag.org. It has a lot of material and an organizational chart. And also go to the ultimate website for information about attorneys general, nag.org. More about that later. Now, in the United States today, between 12 and 13,000 lawyers work for attorneys general. They're the lawyers for the state. They're overwhelmingly career. They come, they do their job, they represent state agencies, they enforce the law, they settle cases, and it's rare that any of us live a single day of our life without having been impacted by the legal decisions that these individuals make. Now, at the top of every AG office is the Attorney General himself or herself. And AG offices are not democracies. What the AG says will do or not do is really in the judgment of that important individual. Now, AG offices did not emerge overnight. They arose from the common law in England in the 1600s. And in that time and place, it was important that the rule of law emerge so that people were not just governed by the whim of the king. And the Attorney General was seen as a way to push back on excessive executive power. And so every one of our colonies had an Attorney General. And after our revolution in 1776, every single new state established an Attorney General. And in every one of these cases, the AG was not appointed by the governor and had a degree of independence, was separate. And that was on purpose. It was because our founding fathers believed in a separation of power. And the AG is seen as a natural break on that to make sure that we continue to be governed by the rule of law and not by the whim of whomever, short-term whim of whoever succeeded in the last election. So AGs have always had a strong level of independence. That does not mean, however, that the AGs get to do whatever they want. They're obviously constrained by budgets, state statutes, case law. They represent agencies which kind of want to be able to tell their lawyers what to do on any given day. So there are a lot of restrictions on what an attorney general does. The independence is not complete. And this is before we get to the issue of the politics of it. Since 43 of the state attorneys general are elected statewide in a partisan manner, and therefore are impacted by all the polarization and pressure that we all feel from our elected officials. Now, this means, therefore, that the Office of Attorney General is kind of the perfect meld between law, which always must come first, and public policy. But of course, public policy is by definition personal. And so where public policy begins and politics ends is obviously in the eye of the beholder. So let's try to figure this out, dig a little deeper. And I'll divide my talk into 3 parts. The first is, what is it that AGs are supposed to do? The second is, what kind of resources do they have available to fulfill these responsibilities? And the third is, how do they actually do it? How do they organize themselves so that this all becomes possible? So what is it that AGs do? Well, they're the lawyers for the state. The vast majority of legal work done by state government is done by career assistant AGs. And they are increasingly long-term employees. Elections may come and go, AGs may come and go, but the staffs of Attorney General's office in large part continue without regard to a particular election, and that's the way it's supposed to be. They're supposed to be enforcing the law. They also, in addition to their civil agency responsibilities, they issue formal opinions, and all AGs have some criminal responsibility. In 3 states, the AG responsibility is exclusive, but in almost every state it's concurrent with district attorneys, and this is an issue which is emerging, especially as attorneys general are increasingly investigating and prosecuting members of police departments for misconduct. So that's a growing and important kind of issue. Now, this might make you think that attorneys general are pretty much restricted by their jurisdiction actually granted to them, and that's simply not true. So let me give you an example. Let's say in a given state, the Attorney General has no jurisdiction over the crime of domestic violence, that crime is left exclusively to district attorneys and to local police officers. So you could research the law and conclude, well, the AGs don't do anything on domestic violence. But that wouldn't be true, because attorneys general can mount up into what they can call the bully pulpit and speak out on issues that are important to the people of the state. So, using the same example, attorneys general offices train police officers at the Criminal Justice Academy. They lobby for bills in the legislature. They work with advocacy groups. An attorney general can appoint a domestic violence task force. Attorney general can speak in schools. Attorneys general can work with attorneys general of other states that do have express jurisdiction. They can lobby Congress. All of these things an attorney general can do in an area, even if they're not granted express jurisdiction to do it. If they see a problem, and the attorneys general are activists, they want to step up, get into that bully pulpit, and see what they can do to make their state better, safer, and more law-abiding. Now, what kind of resources do they have to do this? Well, the largest state AG office, not surprisingly, is the Civil Service Office of California, which has between 12 and 1,300 lawyers. Most AG offices weigh in about 150 and provide advice to agencies and also litigation support when, in fact, the state gets sued, as we all do, right? State government makes mistakes just like the rest of us, and so there's liability there. The AGs then authorize these assistant AGs to work on cases in an organized fashion. In other words, the legislatures have long since decided that actual litigation should be centralized in each state government, and that centralization should occur in the Office of Attorney General. So an agency really, in most cases, can't go to court unless their assistant AG and ultimately their Attorney General signs off and says they can do it. All right, so with this as a basis, there are examples where AGs are hiring outside counsel. They always have for routine matters, collecting money, routine conflict of interest, helping DAs in rural counties. But increasingly, we're seeing outside counsel in 2 areas. In one area, on a hot button issue, we're finding AGs actually retaining advocacy groups to argue on behalf of the state. It's not a great practice, but it happens. And the second thing that AGs do, to varying degrees, is to hire contingent counsel who basically have a stake in the outcome, to go after a particular corporation or particular business practice and then keep a percentage of their own because the AG office lacks the internal staff to handle some of these particularly large cases. But notwithstanding these outside counsel trends, the overwhelming amount of work for state government legal work is done by government employees, and that's the way it should be. All right, now how do they divide themselves up? How do they actually do it? Well, organizational charts may vary, but I've studied this for a long time, and you find that the functionality actually falls into certain distinct categories. The Attorney General, the Chief Deputy, the Chief of Staff, the head of the Civil Division, the head of the Criminal Division, the Solicitor General, and the Public Protection Outreach Division. So let's take these one at a time. Now, the Attorney General, as I said, 43 are elected. They all have kind of political skills. That's not necessarily partisan skills, but the kind of skills that you need to get ahead, to be able to deal with people, to understand conflicting points of view. That's the Attorney General. The Chief Deputy Attorney General is a very, very powerful person, always a terrific lawyer, always close to the Attorney General. It is the Chief Deputy's job to make sure that the entire office runs within the budget and speaks consistently to the courts, because different agencies, different issues come up at different times. You can't argue inconsistently, and it's the job of the Chief Deputy to have to say no to a lot of people. No to his or her own staff, no to state agencies, and most important, walk into the AG's office, sit down, look the Attorney General in the eye and say, you can't do that. That's the Chief Deputy's pretty important job. All right, Civil Deputy, about 70% of most AG offices are representing state agencies, funded by those state agencies in most cases. And the Civil Deputy is someone who's risen up through the ranks and really kind of understands how state government works, the machinations of it. How do you make it work? How do you keep everybody on the same page? Then you have the Criminal Deputy. Now here you have someone, usually a very experienced criminal prosecutor. Maybe came from a DA's office, maybe from a U.S. Attorney's office. And this is, AG offices get really big criminal cases. This is when they break out into the news in the big time. And now when we're dealing increasingly with this movement to have attorneys general investigate police allegations of police misconduct, then you're really seeing the criminal division become an extremely important and emerging section in virtually every state. And then you have the Solicitor General. Solicitor General is the man or the woman who runs a pretty small division, and they're designed to handle appellate cases, look at briefs, try to look at the long-term interest of the state in its appellate courts. This was always a pretty quiet place until recently. You're finding states challenging federal jurisdiction, and that becomes very big news. States are in front of the United States Supreme Court more than any other party except the federal government itself. States are in the front of the Supreme Court more than any other party except the federal government itself, and it's the Solicitor General who has to argue those cases. Now, legally, Solicitor General is just one more assistant AG serving at the pleasure of his or her boss, the Attorney General, but they have emerged as a more powerful force. And finally, the Public Protection Division. This is where the Attorney General gets to assert his or her own view of public policy without having a state agency really define those parameters. So we're talking consumer protection, antitrust, charities, labor, civil rights. These are areas where an Attorney General can decide to proceed or not proceed based on perhaps their philosophy. These offices aren't particularly large, maybe 10% of the whole AG staff, but they generate about 95% of the publicity. And this is where you see most of the big multi-state cases that you hear about, especially in the areas of antitrust and consumer protection, where cases are oftentimes settled for billions of dollars. That's billions with a B. It's a lot of money. So if the AG's office is operating well, you'll see all of these individuals in the room at the same time, funneling information to the Attorney General. Chief Deputy, Chief of Staff, who has to relate to all of the legislative arms, the political arms, the ability to deal with the media, deal with crisis management. That oftentimes happens in the Chief of Staff's office. The Civil Deputy, the Criminal Deputies, Solicitor General, Public Protection. The wise Attorney General doesn't make a big decision without all those people in the room at the same time. When they're not, well, that's when you start getting some mistakes. And AGs, of course, do make mistakes. Sometimes they're serious ones. So that's the summary. Now, we have a few national organizations that speak to offices of attorneys general. By far the most important is the National Association of Attorneys General, NAG. NAG.org. You go there, you'll find a lot of information about attorneys general. There's a great amount of material on their powers and duties broken out by state. It's really a terrific resource. NAG is a nonpartisan operation. Very important. It is nonpartisan. It refuses to go down any political party's rabbit hole, even though they're often asked to do so. They provide the infrastructure for multi-state training, for conferences, and it is very important to note that NAG receives no corporate money. Repeat, NAG receives no corporate money. It is funded by dues, by settlements. They distribute the tobacco funds. It's located in Washington, D.C. Staff about 50 or 60 people. Top flight organization. Okay. But what about the politics here, okay? Why am I ducking the politics? Well, for obvious reasons. AGs are all partisan. There is no such thing as a nonpartisan attorney general. Let me make that clear. There's no such thing as a nonpartisan attorney general. And so naturally, they're impacted by their personal beliefs, by elections, and so they're driven by the same polarization which we're feeling all across our society. So they each have an organization. The Republican AGs Association, RAGA, and Democratic AGs Association, DAGA. They're both located in Washington. They both have sophisticated staff. They do polling, they do strategy, but mostly they raise money, and they raise a lot of it because AG races are now national in scope, and the vast majority of money most AGs raise for their own campaigns comes from out of state. And so who do they get this money from? Well, basically, they'll take the money from who will ever donate. But this includes dark money, it includes political action committees, and it actually includes funding from companies or entities that are subject to direct litigation by an attorney general. And they set up secret meetings to talk about these cases with attorneys general, obviously very, very controversial, and also perhaps an inherent part of our current political structure, where campaign finance laws aren't operable. AGs have to get money someplace, and so RAGA and DAGA play that role of streaming that money. But you know, for all of that, for all the partisanship, for all the fights on the hot button issues, the assistant AGs are out there doing their cases every day, almost not paying any attention to this. And very recently, AGs will settle through, you'll see 30, 40, 45 states will get together, obviously across party lines, and settle a very, very large case against a particular entity that have violated the consumer protection laws or antitrust laws of this country. So it's in that regard that I want to then focus on the relationship of attorneys general and our federal government. Okay, federal government, trillions of dollars go from the federal government to states. That requires a lot of state lawyering. They get along. There are federal agencies that expressly want joint enforcement actions made with the states. They do it. They get along. However, the only time you really hear about it is when they argue. And these are over on these hot button, highly divisive issues that have taken on a partisan hue. And there's strong division between with the AGs who are not of the same political party of the president filing multitude lawsuits. And then when we get a new president, it flips around and goes the other way. So, but don't lose track of the fact that the overwhelming amount of relationship between the AG offices and the federal government is one of cooperation. So that's about it. There are a lot of different trends we can talk about. There's a lot to do, but this has been a long class. So thanks for joining me. Class dismissed.